mountain had always been a living thing. It breathed through the shifting winds, exhaled in blizzards, whispered in the cracks of frozen rivers, and sometimes, when the night was too still, it seemed to pulse beneath the snow like a sleeping beast. For years he had lived with it, not against it, learning the quiet ways of its mood. His cabin stood near the edge of a long white valley where the wind gathered its fury before sweeping down toward the coast. Most men would have called it a hostile place, a patch of wilderness too cruel for a single soul to endure. But to him, it was home in the purest sense of the word. Every beam of wood, every nail, every stone packed into the foundation carried the memory of his hands and his stubbornness. He had come there not to escape the world, but to return to something the world had long forgotten. He liked to say that the mountain didn't care who you were before you arrived. It didn't care what kind of car you drove, what your job title said, or what people thought about your worth. Out there, all that mattered was what you could build, what you could endure, and how you treated the silence that surrounded you. When he first arrived, the locals called him a fool. They saw him bringing up piles of lumber and drums of water, tools wrapped in canvas, and an old wood stove strapped to a sled. It was early winter, and they warned him that the ground would freeze solid before he could dig his foundation. They said that no man in his right mind tried to build that high on the slope, where avalanches rolled like thunder and the wind ripped shingles straight from the roof. He had only smiled, thanked them kindly, and kept to his plan. Because he wasn't looking for comfort or approval. He was looking for a place where everything unnecessary could finally fall away. The first winter nearly took him. The storms came early and heavy, and the weight of the snow pressed so hard against the cabin walls that he could hear the timbers groan at night. The cold seeped through every seam, biting at his bones. When the thaw came, the ground beneath his cabin began to the logs shifted just enough to make him realize danger. The structure leaned slightly but unmistakably toward the valley. A man with sense would have gone to town for help, but since, as most people used it, the luxury had given up he spent days studying the land, walking around the cabin with a shovel in hand and frost in his beard. He noticed how the sun shone during the day and how the northern wall remained shaded even at noon. He saw how meltwater trickled down from the higher rocks, refroze at dusk, and built delicate ridges of ice that shone like glass in the pale light. That was when the idea first took shape, not as a grand plan or stroke of genius, but as a whisper from the mountain. He would build an ice wall. The neighbors, when they heard, laughed outright. They told him that ice was no material for a foundation, that the first warm spell would melt his work into useless. One of them, a man from down in the village who'd spent his life logging and hauling freight, came by just to see the fool's project. He found him out there with buckets of water, pouring thin layers over the slope, letting them freeze before adding more. For weeks he carried water up from the spring day after day, freezing it into thick terraces that gleamed blue and white in the winter sun. The wall grew slowly, each layer locking the one beneath it into place until it stood, frozen rampart, holding the earth firm beneath the cabin. It looked absurd, even to his own eyes, but as the days passed, the ice didn't weaken. Instead, it hardened, fusing with the snowpack and the frozen soil, creating a solid barrier that reflected the sun and redirected the meltwater away from the foundation. When spring finally came and the neighboring slopes began to sag under the weight of thawing snow, his cabin stood firm. The ice wall held. He didn't boast. He didn't go down to the village to prove anyone wrong. That wasn't his way. He simply sat by his small window one evening, listening to the wind scrape over the frozen ridges, and smiled. He knew he had done something right, not by defying nature, but by understanding it well enough to move with it. People often think that solitude drives a man to madness. That's only true if the silence feels empty. His silence was full of the creak of ice underfoot, the slow ticking of the stove as it cooled at night, the soft groan of wood expanding in the cold. It was music, a rhythm he'd come to love more than any conversation. He would wake before dawn, long before the sun breached, step outside to breathe in the air so clean it almost burned. The world was nothing but shades of gray and blue then. The snow sparkled faintly like powdered stars. Sometimes he thought of the people who called him a fool, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet amusement. They were good folk, hard-working and loyal, but they had built their lives around noise, convenience, things that had no place. They couldn't understand why a man would spend half his days freezing water just to make more ice. But to him, the act itself is its own kind of prayer, slow, deliberate, and patient. He learned to trust the mountain as one might trust a friend who speaks little but never lies. It taught him that survival isn't about resisting hardship, but about listening to what hardship is trying to tell you. Every frozen night, every collapsed snowbank, every small victory became part of his education. And when the storms howled like wild beasts through the valley, he would sit inside by the light of his lantern and feel something close to gratitude. The cabin might shudder, the roof might groan, but it stood, held in place by a wall of ice that everyone had sworn would fail. The strange thing about that wall was that it didn't melt away when spring arrived. The shadow of the cabin and the high ridge behind it kept the ice thick and shaded long into summer. Even when it began to shrink, it did so evenly, maintaining its form until the cold returned again. It became a kind of seasonal pulse, waxing and waning with the mountain's breath. Over time, moss began to creep over the stones and frozen ridges near it, giving it an almost ancient look, as though it had always belonged there. He began to notice changes in himself, too. The man who had once hurried through life, chasing deadlines and drowning in the noise of other people's opinion, now moved slowly, deliberately, as if matching the pace of the mountain. He no longer cared for the news of the world or the endless cycle of complaint. Distraction filled the airway. His world was measured by the length of the and the sound of crack in the morning. When people occasionally made the trek up to see him, hikers, hunters, or curious locals, they found a man weathered but calm, eyes bright and steady, speaking softly as though words themselves should not disturb the peace. Some came to mock him again, still convinced that his way of living was foolish, but they would leave quieter than they arrived, carrying something they couldn't quite name, maybe a sense that there was more strength in stillness than in all the noise they'd left behind. He never sought to convince them of anything. He believed that wisdom couldn't be taught in words. It had to be lived, felt, endured. His ice wall had not just saved his cabin, it had saved him too, though not in the way anyone else would understand. It had shown him that what others call foolishness might simply be courage, waiting for time to prove it right. Out there, every mistake was visible, every choice carried a consequence, and yet there was freedom in that. The mountain didn't forgive or punish, it simply responded. Build wrong, and the snow would crush your work. Build right, and it would stand for generations. That kind of honesty was rare in the world below, where excuses and appearances softened every truth. Up here, everything was raw and exact. He liked to sit on the small bench outside his door. The light faded behind the peaks, watching the last rays turn the ice wall into a fire. It glowed golden and pink before sinking back to shadow, and in that glow, he saw something sacred, the quiet proof that even the coldest, hardest can hold life if shaped with patience. That night, when he lay in bed listening to the wind against the eaves, he felt a calm so deep it almost frightened. It was the kind of peace that doesn't need words, doesn't need company, only the soft certainty that you are exactly where you're meant to be. The mountain no longer felt like a challenge to survive, but a companion that mirrored his own silence. And maybe that's what people in the valley would never understand, that there's a kind of happiness born not from ease, but from struggle, embraced with open hand. When you stop fighting the world and start listening to it, even the ice becomes an ally. Tell me, from where are you watching this story unfold? I'm curious to know which corner of the world you're in as we sit here, together, among the winds and ice of his Alaskan home. He had not always been a man of silence. Once, long before the mountain knew his footsteps, he had lived surrounded by the hum of electricity, the weight of deadlines, the endless traffic, other people's ambition. His days had been marked not by sunrise or snowfall, but by screens that glowed deep into the night, and by the shrill sound of phones demanding answers he didn't owe anyone. He had worked in engineering, designing systems meant to control nature, flood barriers, drainage grids, structures of steel and concrete that promised order against the chaos of the earth. He had been good at it, perhaps too good, because his name began to appear in reports and conferences where people spoke in numbers but not in truth. He had believed for a time that progress could be measured in data. But the thing about building walls, even strong ones, is that they sometimes build themselves inside you as well. He began to notice how little he heard anymore. Not just the quiet sounds of life, birds, rain, the wind through trees, but the sound of his own thought, his own breathing. The city had a way of stealing that from a man without him realizing. You wake up one morning and realize the silence that comforts you instead feels foreign, as if your own mind has grown loud enough to drown it. There had been a woman once, too. She had loved him in that gentle way that only people who still believe in light can love. Her name doesn't matter now. He spoke it to the wind one last time the day he left and never used it again. She had been patient with his long nights at the office, his restless energy, his constant need to prove something. But patient, even the strongest kind, erode. There came a night when he found her standing by the window, staring out at the rain, as if the city had already taken her somewhere he couldn't follow. She told him she couldn't hear him anymore, not but because everything he said seemed wrapped in exhaustion. He remembered the silence that followed. It was the first true silence of his life. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hums like a wound. He left and walked for hours through the streets, through puddles, reflecting the grays, until dawn found him on the edge of the harbor, watching ships vanish into fog. Something inside him broke. But it wasn't a clean break. It was the slow cracking of certainty, the realization that he had built a life so carefully engineered that there was no space left to breathe. For months he kept working, but every plan he drew began to feel like a lie. The numbers made sense, the structures were perfect on paper, yet something essential was missing, that pulse of truth that only nature understands. Then came the flood. It had not been his fault entirely, though his name appeared on the report. The river outside the city had swelled beyond all recorded limits, tearing through the barriers his firm had designed. He had stood there on the bridge as the water rose, furious and alive, watching the current carry away years of human calculation as if they were nothing but dust. When it was over, he went back to his office, sat down at his desk, stared at the blue spread before him. All the lines, the precision, the false promise and control. It felt absurd. He understood in that moment that man was not meant to master the world, to live within it, to learn its rhythm rather than dictate it. That understanding didn't make him wise right away. It only made him restless. He left the city without a plan, sold what little he owned, packed his tools, and drove north. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because he didn't know himself. He just followed the road until it turned into gravel, then dirt, then nothing at all. The last town he passed through was a place where the mountains looked like they were swallowing the sky. The people there were kind but wary, the way mountain people often are. They told him about an old logging trail that led up to an abandoned plateau. It had good soil, a steady stream, plenty, but no one stayed there long. Too cold, too lonely. Lonely? He had heard that word so often it had lost its meaning. What frightened most people about solitude was not the absence of company, but the presence of themselves. Up there would be no one to distract him, no one to blame, no noise to fill the gaps. That was exactly what he wanted. The first months were brutal. He built a small shelter out of tarps and salvaged wood, sleeping in layers of blankets that never seemed thick enough. His hands cracked open from the cold, his tools froze solid at night, and sometimes he woke to find the wind had buried half his supplies under snow. But he stayed. Every hardship felt like a lesson, every wound like proof that he was finally alive again. He learned to read the cloud, to tell the difference between the distant rumble of thunder, the low groan of... He learned that a man can survive almost anything if he stops acting it. The day he began building the cabin was the first day he felt truly at peace. The smell of sawdust in the frozen air, the echo of his hammer striking wood, it all reminded him that creation was not the opposite of destruction, its answer. He worked slowly, alone, cutting each log by hand, fitting them together until the structure began to rise out of the snow like something born from the mountain. Sometimes, when the work was done for the day, he would sit by the fire and think of her. He didn't feel sadness, only gratitude. She had been the last voice that tethered him to the world below, and losing her had forced him to listen to quieter voices. He used to think that love meant holding on, but out there he learned that love can also mean letting go, trusting the silent, carry what words never. Years passed quietly. He stopped counting seasons and began to measure time instead by the rhythm of his work. The chopping of wood, the layering of snow, the long waits for ice thicken. He wrote sometimes in an old notebook, though not a past. Mostly, he wrote observations of the mountain, the way the light shifted across slopes, how the animals moved when the weather changed. His handwriting grew slower, steadier, like the man himself. There were moments of fear, of course. Nights when the wind screamed like a thing alive, the cabin trembled. Days when hunger pressed hard, and he wondered if he had made a mistake coming there. But each time he considered turning back, the mountain offered some small sign. A break in the cloud, revealing a fox crossing the snow with effort, the quiet satisfaction of fire catching on the first strike of flint. It was as if the land itself whispered. He didn't know when the locals began calling him the Hermit. The first time he heard it, he laughed. He didn't see himself as separate from them, only as someone who had chosen a different kind of life. Sometimes they came up to trade coffee, salt, or lamp oil in exchange for firewood or smoked fish. They told stories of the world below, and he listened politely, but without desire. The more they spoke, the more he felt the distance between their lives and his own. They seemed caught in an endless cycle of wanting. New machines, new distraction, new noise. Up there, everything he wanted could fit into his hand. He wasn't running from people. He was running toward something purer, toward a version of himself stripped of the weight of expectation. The mountain didn't ask him to be successful, only sincere. It didn't demand perfection, only present. That's freedom. One evening, years after he'd built the cabin and the ice wall that would later become legend, he found himself staring into the fire and realizing he no longer remembered the sound of the city. He could picture it, the traffic, the crowd, the glow of windows stacked high, but it felt like another lifetime belonging to another man. He thought about how much time he'd spent trying to be seen, to be acknowledged, when all along what he truly needed to disappear for a while. Not vanish, but dissolve into something larger. He realized then that the mountain wasn't isolated. It was communion. Every crack in the ice, every shift in the snowpack, every breath of wind through the spruce, a kind of conversation, a dialogue didn't need words. For the first time, he wasn't alone with his thoughts. He was part of something alive, something that listened back. When he finally spoke again after hours, his own voice startled him. It sounded deeper, slower, as if it had aged with the rocks. He whispered, almost smiling, that he had found what he was looking for. Not peace, not redemption, but understanding. That understanding would later shape everything he built, everything he endured, the ice wall, the cabin, the long winters spent in solitude. All of it was born from that moment of quiet revelation that a man can lose everything and still find himself whole if he listens closely enough to the world it holds. And so he stayed, and in staying, he became part of the mountain's story, a living reminder that the foolishness of one man can sometimes be the wisdom of another. If you've been listening and somehow felt a piece of your own story in his, perhaps that's because silence speaks the same language everywhere. And if you'd like to keep walking with him through the snow, hearing what the world sounds like when everything unnecessary fades away, you can stay close. Subscribe and come back to the mountain whenever you need to remember what stillness feels like. His days began before the light reached the valley. He would wake not to the sound of alarms or engines, but to the subtle shifting of the cold, the faint groan of the logs in the cabin as they expanded with the first warmth of fire he rekindled. The air inside was sharp enough to sting his throat when he breathed, and each exhale rose like smoke in the dim glow. He moved slowly, not out of laziness, but reverence. The mountain had taught him that nothing of value hurried. He would place a few dry splinters into the stove, strike the flint once or twice, and watch the spark grow into a fragile flame. That tiny flame was always a promise, proof that even in a place of endless frost, warmth could still be born from patience. He didn't keep clocks anymore. Time, as most people measured it, had become meaningless. The sun and the shadows on the ice were all the schedule he needed. When the first pale light spilled through the window, he would step outside, sometimes without even putting on his coat, to let the cold remind him where he was. The valley stretched wide and silent, a vast ocean of snow broken only by the dark shapes of spruce and the distant peaks, the dawn in soft pink hues. The world seemed untouched, unbothered by human noise. Out there, even his breath felt too loud. He began each morning by walking to the stream below the ridge, carrying 2 metal buckets. The stream never fully froze. Beneath the surface, the water moved in slow, glassy waves, whispering beneath the ice. He would kneel and break a thin crust with his knife, filling the buckets one by one, his reflection shivering in cold water. The act was simple, yet it carried the weight of ritual. Each drop was earned, not given. Each step on the way back up the slope was a reminder that survival here was not a fight, but a conversation, one in which effort and respect spoke louder than force. His meals were modest. Bread he baked once a week, dried fish, sometimes stew made from root vegetables, he grew in a small insulated plot during the short summer. There was no indulgence, no waste. Somehow everything tasted richer, and he remembered from his old life. Hunger, he learned, was the best seasoning. Eating alone didn't feel lonely, it felt honest. There was no need to fill silence with chatter or thought. The crackle of fire and the sound of his spoon against the bowl were enough. After breakfast, he worked. There was always something to mend or tend to. The ice wall, the wood pile, the roof, the mountain allowed no laziness. If he ignored a creak in the foundation or a leak in the chimney, it would remind him soon enough. He had come to love this accountability. In the world below, consequences were delayed, softened by excuses and systems designed to hide them. Here, everything was immediate. If you forgot to gather firewood, you froze. If you left food unsealed, the foxes. If you underestimated storm, It humbled you. Work became meditation. When he split wood, his body moved with rhythm. Lift, breathe, strike, listen. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and sure. Sometimes he paused, axe resting on his shoulder, to watch the flakes of frost catch sunlight as they drifted around him. They looked like fragments of glass suspended in air, each one unique, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He would smile, feeling small in the best possible way. He spoke little, sometimes going weeks without hearing another voice. Yet he never felt starved for company. The mountain itself seemed to speak in its own language, a language of sound and stillness. He had learned to read its moods the way a sailor reads the sea. When the wind shifted from the north, he knew snow was coming. When the ravens flew low, it meant a storm was near. When the wolves howled far off in the valley, it meant the air was warming again. Each sign was a form of conversation, a subtle exchange, man and land. There were nights when he would sit outside long after darkness swallowed, wrapped in his thick coat, watching the aurora dance across the sky. The colors would twist and ripple like silk, green, violet, faint orange, and he would feel as if the universe were breathing. Sometimes he laughed quietly to himself, because no one would ever believe how alive the silence could be. There, under that shifting light, he often thought of the world below, cities glowing with artificial colors, people chasing meaning through noise, and he felt no anger, no superiority, only a calm sadness for what. In his solitude, he discovered something he had never truly known before. Attention. Without distractions, every small detail came alive. The pattern of frost on a window pane looked like the veins of a leaf. The sound of snow melting from the roof was like a steady heart, even pain. The sting of cold on his fingers, the ache in his muscles, felt cleaner, sharper, more honest. Pain wasn't the enemy. It was simply proof of being alive. He kept a journal, not to record events, but to capture moments of stillness. His entries were brief and unadorned. Wind from the west today, found wolf tracks near the stream, ice wall holding steady. Sometimes he wrote reflections instead. The world down there tries to control water. Up here, I listen to it. Or, the silence is not empty. It's full of everything I used to ignore. He had a small radio that still worked when the weather allowed. He used it sparingly, tuning into news or music once every few weeks, just to hear the texture of human voices. But the more time passed, the less he turned it on. The words from the world below began to sound foreign, hurried, anxious. People arguing, promising, selling. All the things he had once considered normal now seemed hollow. It wasn't judgment he felt. It was clarity. The noise of civilization no longer reached him in the same way because he no longer carried its frequency inside him. One winter, an early thaw sent torrents of meltwater rushing through the valley. The ice wall groaned under the strain, cracking like thunder in the night. He woke and ran outside barefoot, the snow burning his feet to see the water rise. For hours he worked in the dark, shoveling channels, reinforcing weak points with snow and stones, his breath steaming in the cold. When the storm finally passed, he stood before the cabin soaked, exhausted, but the wall had held again. In that moment, under the pale light of dawn, he felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude, not triumph, belonging. He realized the mountain had accepted him not because he had conquered it, but because he had learned to serve it. There was a peace that followed him everywhere after that. It wasn't loud or joyous. It was and steady, like the beat of his own heart. He moved through his days with a sense of rhythm that matched the world around him. Wake, work, rest, listen. Each evening he lit his lamp and read by its dim light. Though the same few books had long been memorized, he often found himself whispering lines aloud, savoring the way the words felt in the still air. Sometimes he would write his own lines beside them, not for anyone to read, but because language itself felt like a gift too beautiful to abandon. In spring, snow receded and the moss returned. He tended a small garden near the cabin. He had cleared stones by hand and fenced it with branches. The soil was stubborn and cold, but he treated it gently, layering it with ash and compost until it grew soft enough. Watching those small green shoots break the frost gave him a joy by. Each plant was a miracle of patience, a quiet rebellion against the harshness of the world. He had few visitors, but sometimes the same children from the valley would climb up the trail to see the Ice Man, as they called him. They would stand in awe of the glimmering wall, listening to the faint creaks and groans of frozen water. He never shooed them away. Instead, he'd offer them warm tea and stories, simple ones about foxes, storms, and stars. They listened with wide eyes, and though they didn't understand his words fully, they felt the weight of it. Before leaving, they often asked him if he ever got lonely. He would smile and tell them the truth. That loneliness is only the shadow of noise, and when noise is gone, all that remains is peace. At night, before sleep, he would step outside one last time to look at the horizon. The stars above seemed infinite, and for a moment small enough to vanish and eternal enough to belong. The mountain had stripped him bare, but in doing so, it had revealed something unbreakable, the quiet strength of simply being, and that was his life, day after day, season after season. No rush, no ambition, no waiting for something better to come, just the steady rhythm of existence, the hum of wind, the patience of snow, and the deep satisfaction of having nothing left to prove. He had found not isolation, but connection, not escape, but arrival. It began not with a loud sound, not like thunder or wind, but a low, deep murmur that came from beneath the ground one afternoon in early spring. He was out by the ice wall, checking for cracks after a mild thaw, when he felt the vibration through his boots. It was as though the mountain had exhaled from its very core. He froze, shovel in hand, listening. The sound faded, then returned, longer, heavier, rolling through the valley like something ancient waking from sleep. He had lived there long enough to know the difference between the shifting of ice and the movement of earth. This was no ordinary settling, the mountain stirring. That night, the wind carried an unease he hadn't felt in years. The air was too warm for the season, the snowpack too heavy. He knew the danger those conditions brought. Wet snow, unstable layers, the whisper of avalanche. He went to bed early, but didn't sleep much. The cabin creaked, the walls sighed, and every sound outside seemed amplified. When dawn came, strange light filled the sky, hazy and orange. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Then it came. A deep crack echoed from above, followed by a roar that made the air itself tremble. The avalanche, a white river of destruction, tumbling a farce, devouring trees, swallowing boulders, and throwing a snow taller than houses. It wasn't heading straight for his cabin, but the shock wave shook the valley, and he could see fractures spidering across the ridge near his ice wall. For a moment, he stood perfectly still. Then instinct took over. He ran to the storage shed, grabbed his shovel and axe, and began reinforcing the lower bank with snowblock and stone. He moved with a kind of calm urgency, guided not by panic, but by purpose. He had lived long enough with the mountain to understand that fear wastes strength, or you perish. There is no in-between. The ground shook again, the cracks widened. A section of the ice wall began to split, sending shards cascading down in glittering arcs. The sound was deafening, like glass breaking across the sky. He shouted, though there was no one to hear him, and drove his shovel into the snow again and again, throwing it up against the weak spot, trying to brace the base before the pressure tore it apart completely. It was strange what crossed his mind in those moments. Not fear of death, not regret, but a simple, clear thought. Everything I have built is about to be tested. And then it was. The avalanche hit the far side of the valley first, slamming into the ridge with the force of a storm. The shock rippled through the earth, and snow poured down the slopes. For a heartbeat, he thought the wall would break. He heard it groan, saw cracks race across its surface, but the water he had layered over the years, the careful freezing and refreezing, had turned it into something stronger than ice alone. The pressure hit, the wall flexed, and then held. The roar faded slowly, replaced by the hiss of settling snow, a steady drip of meltwater. He leaned on his shovel, chest heaving, staring at the glistening barrier that had just saved his life. Steam rose from his breath, mingling with the mist. The wall was scarred but standing, a shimmering monument to patience and defiance. He spent the rest of the day inspecting the damage. The foundation had shifted slightly. The outer layers cracked in places. The structure was intact. The snow that had cascaded down the slope piled high around it, forming a new base that would freeze solid overnight. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to help him rebuild. He smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition. He had listened, and the mountain had answered. When night fell, he sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. His hands were swollen and raw, but his mind was still, clear in a way it hadn't been in years. He thought of how the villagers had once mocked his wall, calling it foolish, fragile, temporary, and yet that same wall had just saved him from being buried alive. The irony made him chuckle softly. Maybe all true wisdom looks foolish at first, but as he watched the firelight flicker across the logs, another thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't shake. The tremors he had felt earlier, the strange warmth in the air, the avalanche's size, weren't normal. Something was changing in the mountain. It wasn't anger he sensed, imbalance. He knew enough about ice to recognize when it was melting too soon, when the freeze no longer held as long as it should. The seasons had begun to shift. Over the next few weeks, he studied the patterns closely. The stream ran faster, the snowpacks above thinned earlier, and the birds returned sooner than ever before. The ice wall began to sweat even in the shade. He knew it was only a matter of time before it weakened for good. For years, he had believed the mountain to be eternal, unchanging, a fixed truth against which his small life played out. Now he saw that even mountains change, that even silence has a pulse. At first, the realization unsettled him. He had built his peace on the permanence of this place, the reliability of its cold and solitude. But the more he thought about it, the more he understood that impermanence was not the enemy. The mountain was alive, breathing, shifting, evolving, and so was he. He decided to rebuild the wall differently this time. He would blend stone into the ice, layer by layer, shaping a hybrid barrier that could withstand both heat and cold. The work was grueling. He carried rocks from the ridge, sometimes hauling them by rope when the slope was too steep. He melted snow by fire to pour over each layer, letting the water freeze around the stones like mortar. It took him weeks, working from dawn until the stars appeared, his back aching, hands bleeding, but he didn't mind. Each swing of the hammer, each scrape of the shovel was a conversation with the land, a shared labor between man and mountain. By midsummer, the wall stood taller and stronger than before. It wasn't beautiful in the way ice alone had been. It was rough, uneven, marked stone, but it felt right. It was a testament to balance, a merging of elements that once seemed opposed. When he finished, he stood before it in the twilight and whispered and that's when he noticed a strange, faint glow along the base where ice met rock. At first, he thought it was the light of the setting sun, but as night deepened, the glow remained, a soft, bluish luminescence, like the breath of something ancient trapped beneath the surface. He crouched, touched the frozen wall, and felt an almost imperceptible vibration. It wasn't dangerous. It was alive. The ice was singing. He sat there for a long time, listening. The sound was so low it was more a feeling than a noise. A resonance hummed through his bones. It wasn't mystical. It was natural, though no less wondrous. He realized the stones he'd used were rich in quartz, and the shifting of ice against them created a faint piezoelectric. The mountain, through his wall, had learned to speak in light. He smiled again, that quiet smile of a man who has stopped needing miracles because he's surrounded by them. He knew no one would believe him if he told the story, and that was fine. The mountain didn't need witness. It only needed presence. Months passed, and word of the avalanche reached the valley. A few men climbed up to see how he had survived. They found him sitting outside the cabin, carving wood, calm as ever. They asked him how bad it had been, whether the wall had held. He nodded, said it had, and offered them tea. One of them, the same man who had mocked him years ago, looked up at the shimmering barrier and shook his head. "Guess it wasn't such a fool's wall after all," he said. He laughed softly. "Maybe it still is," he replied, "but sometimes the mountain respects a fool more than a coward." They left before sunset, shaking their heads, half in disbelief, half in admiration. When they were gone, he watched the light fade across the wall, faint blue glow returning beneath the ice. He thought about all that had happened, the trembling earth, the avalanche, the heat, the rebuilding, and realized he felt no fear anymore. Whatever came next, he was ready, because the mountain had tested him and he had listened. The world below might still chase control, might still build its fragile towers against time, but up here he had learned the truth. The only way to survive is to belong. And as the night deepened and the northern lights began to stir again, he whispered a small thought to the silence around him, not as a prayer, but as a greeting. Thank you for the lesson. If you've been walking with him through this storm, if you felt that strange pull between fear and peace, stay close to the mountain story. There are still things to discover in the... Subscribe and come back when the wind calls again. There's more the ice will teach before the... The years passed quietly, and with them came a kind of wisdom that only time and solitude can carve into a man's soul. His hair had grown white like the snow that blanketed his cabin each winter, and his hands had become a map of lines and scars, etched a work that never truly ended. Yet his eyes remained the same, calm, bright, and searching, as if they were always looking for the next truth hidden within the silence. The mountain changed him in ways he could never have imagined when he first came, and now, as he sat each evening before the fire, he often found himself wondering about the world below, not with longing, but with a quiet curiosity, as one might. Childhood home long since left behind. He didn't hate what he had left. Hate, he had learned, is just another form of attachment, another way of clinging to what no longer belongs to you. What he felt instead was understanding. The people down there weren't bad. They were simply lost in noise, chasing echoes of meaning instead of the sound itself. They had forgotten how to listen. He thought often about how the world measured worth in numbers, possession, attention, and how easily people mistook movement for progress. Down there, life seemed faster every year, but never deeper. The mountain, by contrast, never hurried, and yet it achieved everything it needed in its own time. He realized that silence is not the absence of sound, the presence of everything unspoken. It is a living thing, vast and patient, waiting for those who are brave enough to meet it. At first, it had frightened him, the way it swallowed every thought, every word, but now he saw it for what it truly was, the space where truth resides when all pretense falls away. The mountain didn't need to shout to teach, it only needed to exist. Some days the sun was high and the air clear enough to see miles across the valley. He would climb the ridge behind his cabin. It was a steep climb, and his knees complained more than they used to, but he still made the journey. From the top, the world stretched endlessly, rivers frozen in silver threads, peaks rising like ancient guardians, clouds cast slow-moving shadows over the snow. Standing there, he always felt the same smallness he'd felt since the first day he arrived, but it no longer frightened him. It comforted him. To be small in such a vast world is not to be insignificant. It is to be in harmony with everything that is. He often wondered what people in the cities would think if they could stand beside him on that ridge. Would they still feel the same urgency, the same need to fill every silence with words, every space with things? Or would the sheer immensity of this stillness quiet them at last? Perhaps that was why he never tried to preach or convince anyone to live as he did. Some truths cannot be told. They must be found. He remembered once, years ago, a journalist who had come up the mountain to find him. Word of his ice wall had spread after the avalanche story reached the papers, and people below had turned it into something mythic. The hermit who outsmarted the winter, they called him. The journalist had expected to find a madman or a genius, perhaps both. What she found instead was an old man offering her tea in a wooden cup and asking nothing in return. She asked him many questions: why he came, why he stayed, what he had learned. He answered honestly but simply, choosing his words the way he chose stones for his wall. She seemed unsatisfied by his calmness, as though she wanted revelation, some great secret to human happiness. When she finally asked if he ever missed the world he left behind, he smiled and said, "I don't miss it, but I still carry it." She looked puzzled, so he explained, "You can leave the noise behind, but its echo stays inside you. The trick is to let it fade without hating." She didn't write that line in her article. Instead, she wrote about his survival, his ingenuity, his mysterious calm. That was fine. The mountain's truth wasn't meant to fit in headlines. After she left, he didn't see another outsider for a long time. The seasons continued their slow turning, and he found joy in the smallest detail. The way frost painted his window each morning in delicate patterns, the way the ravens spoke to each other in the treetops, the way the fire sighed when it settled into coals. Each sound, each sight was a piece of life the world below seemed to have forgotten to notice. He began to think of the mountain not as a place, but as a mirror. It showed him who he was without flattery, without judgment. When he was angry, the storms seemed harsher. When he was patient, the air itself softened. It was as if the land reflected his state of being back at him, teaching him through experience what no philosophy ever could, that peace is not something you find, but something you make, moment by moment, choice by choice. One day, as he sat near the stream, listening to the slow cracking of ice in the current, he thought about how strange it was that people built entire lives trying to avoid hardship, when hardship was the only thing that had ever taught him anything real. Pain had stripped away what was unnecessary, leaving only what mattered. Discomfort had shaped his resilience. Loneliness had refined his ability to love. Even the cold, which once felt like an enemy, become a teacher, showing him that endurance is not defiance, but adaptation. He thought about the word survival and realized it didn't mean what most people believed. Survival was not about victory or conquest. It was about balance. The fox survived not because it was stronger than the snow, but because it moved lightly upon it. The tree survived not because it resisted the wind, but because it bent. Man had forgotten how to bend. He had once heard someone say that modern life was about convenience, that progress was the art of removing difficulty, but he now saw that difficulty was the very shape of meaning. A life without friction was like a story without conflict, smooth, perhaps, but empty. Every hardship he had faced here had given texture to his existence, carving out space for gratitude. The mountain never gave him more than he could bear. It never gave him comfort free. Sometimes he wondered if the mountain was aware of him, if it noticed his small efforts to live in harmony with it. He liked to think it did, in its own way. When the wind quieted, just as he finished chopping wood, or when a gap in the clouds let sunlight fall perfectly across the wall he'd built, it felt like acknowledgement, not reward, but recognition. The same kind of mutual respect shared between old friends who no longer need to speak to understand each. He began to see everything, the storm, the hunger, the silence, as part of a larger conversation between man and nature. Down below, people spoke endlessly but said very little. Up here, he had learned that listening was the higher form of speech. And so, he listened to the creak of branches, to the whisper of snow, to his own heartbeat echoing faintly in the cold. He sometimes imagined what would happen after he was gone. The cabin would slowly sink into the ground, the ice wall would melt, the garden would be reclaimed by moss, and yet he didn't feel sorrow. The idea that everything he had built would return to the mountain seemed right. Nothing lasts forever, and nothing should. Permanence was never the point. Present. In the end, he believed the greatest mistake of the world below was the obsession with permanence, the endless desire to leave a mark, to be remembered. Up here, the wind erased his footprints within minutes, and yet, somehow, he felt more real than ever. When nothing belongs to you, everything is shared. When you stop trying to be remembered, you start to truly live. He often thought of how people chased happiness as though it were something separate from pain. But up here, he had learned that joy and sorrow are not opposite. They are born from the same root, awareness. You cannot feel wonder if you refuse to feel loss. You cannot love the warmth unless you've known the cold. The world below wanted pleasure without pain, growth without struggle, meaning without silence. It was a world afraid of its own shadow. The mountain had no such fear. It accepted everything, the storms, the stillness, the light, the darkness. And so he tried to live as a mountain lived. When joy came, he welcomed it fully. When sorrow came, he welcomed it too. Each emotion passed through him like wet, leaving behind a deeper calm. That calm was not the absence of feeling, but the fullness of understanding. The world no longer felt like something to endure, but something to behold. Every breath, every snowflake, every sunrise was enough. And as he sat one evening, watching the aurora bloom again over the valley, he realized he had become part of the same silence that had once frightened him. He was no longer a visitor in this place. He was part of its rhythm, part of its long, slow heartbeat. He smiled, knowing that if the world below ever found him again, they would still call him a hermit, a recluse, a man who ran away from society. But the truth was simpler. He hadn't run away from the world. He had run toward it. Winter returned once more, as it always did, though this one felt different. The air seemed heavier, the nights longer, and the snow deep than any year before. He could feel the weight of age in his bones now, not as weakness, but as a soft slowing of rhythm, the way the mountain itself slows before a storm. His beard had turned completely white, and his hand shook slightly when he poured water into the kettle each morning. But he moved the same calm purpose as ever, and his eyes still carried a quiet light that seemed to see both the present and something far beyond. He knew, though he never said it aloud, that this winter might be his last. It didn't frighten him. He had lived long enough to understand that everything in nature comes full circle. The snow falls, melts, feeds the stream, and returns again. So too does life return to the soil that once sustained it. Death, to him, was not an end, a continuation, another step in the same great rhythm he had followed since the day he first came to the mountain. The signs were everywhere. The foxes came closer to the cabin now, unafraid. The ravens perched on his roof beams, watching him work with eyes that seemed to know something. Even the wind had changed its song, less wild, more tender, as though it were speaking to him in a tone reserved for farewell. He spent more time sitting by the fire than chopping wood, though he still went out each morning to walk along the ice wall, running his fingers across its frozen surface. The wall had aged with him, scarred, worn, but steadfast, its stones and ice fused into a monument of endurance, glowing faintly when the moon rose. Sometimes he spoke to it quietly, not expecting answers. "You held better than I did," he would say with a faint smile, but I suppose that's as it should be. He began to think about what would remain after he was gone. The cabin would fall eventually, the ice wall would melt, the tools would rust, but perhaps, he thought, the real legacy wasn't in the things he built, but in the silence he left behind, a silence that might linger in the valley, whispering to anyone who dared to listen. Maybe one day someone else would find this place and feel what he had felt, the stillness that teaches without words. There was no fear of being forgotten. In truth, he hoped he would be. The mountain had no need for monuments or memory. Everything here was reborn through forgetting. The snow covered all traces, making each morning a clean slate. He liked the idea of vanishing into that whiteness, of becoming part of the same cycle that shaped him. One evening, as he watched the sunset paint the ice wall in gold and rose, he felt a sudden urge to write again. It had been months since he'd touched his old notebook, but now he pulled it from the shelf and opened to a blank. His handwriting was slow, uneven, but his thoughts clear. He wrote, "I came here looking for peace, but what I found was peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the understanding that struggle is part of everything beautiful. The mountain taught me that silence is not empty fullness, a fullness so vast it holds both joy and sorrow. I have learned nothing we build lasts, and that is the mercy, because if things lasted for, there would be no room for. The world below seeks permanence. The mountain seeks balance. I used to think survival meant holding on. Now I know it means letting go." He paused, then added one last line. "When I am gone, the mountain will remember me not by name, but by silence, and that will be enough." He closed the notebook and set it on the table beside the lantern. The flame flickered low, reflecting in his eyes. Outside, the wind rose and sighed through the trees. The same voice had been his companion for decades. He listened to it for a long time, feeling a warmth that came not from the fire, but from within, the warmth of knowing he had lived exactly as he was. That night, the snow fell heavy and slow, blanketing the valley in a quiet that felt almost sacred. He dreamed of the stream, of sunlight through the pines, of footsteps disappearing into drifts of white. In the dream, he wasn't alone. The mountain was with him, patient, speaking in the only way it ever had, through silence. When morning came, the cabin was still. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, and the footprints that led from the door to the ice wall had already vanished beneath fresh snow. The foxes came by at midday, sniffing the air, then sat quietly by the frozen path. The ravens watched from the trees, but did not call. Everything seemed to pause, as if the world itself were holding a breath. The mountain did not mourn. It simply absorbed what returned to it, as it always had. The cabin stood a while longer, creaking gently in the wind, and the ice wall continued to gleam under the sun. When spring arrived, a thaw ran through the valley, and melt water from the wall flowed into the stream, carrying with it traces of the man who had built it, not in body, but in spirit. His work, his patience, his quiet endurance all dissolved into the current, feeding the same earth that had once fed him. Years passed. The cabin slowly yielded to time, collapsing inward as moss and roots claimed the wood. The ice wall melted in stages, its stones tumbling into the soil. But even as the evidence of his presence disappeared, something invisible remained, a stillness that seemed deeper than before, a calm woven into the very air. Travelers who passed through the valley sometimes spoke of feeling watched, not with fear, but with comfort, as if the mountain itself were aware of them. In the nearest village, stories began to circulate. The elders remembered a man who lived alone up the ridge, the one they had once called a fool for building an ice wall. They told the younger ones how that wall had saved his cabin from destruction, and how, in the years that followed, no one had ever found a trace of him, only the faint shimmer of frost that lingered long after the season. Some said he had become part of the mountain, that his spirit guarded the valley from storms. Others said he simply walked off one morning and kept walking until he vanished into the snow. The truth, as always, belonged to the mountain alone. And somewhere, deep within the frozen layers of the ridge, a thin vein of ice remained, glowing faintly with the same pale blue light that once shimmered through the wall he built. It pulsed softly in the darkness, like a heartbeat, steady and eternal. Those who stood quietly enough could feel it through the soles of their boots, a hum beneath the silence. Most dismissed it as imagination, the echo of wind in the rocks. But a few, the ones who had learned to listen, recognized it for a song of endurance, the whisper of a man who had learned to belong to the earth instead of trying to master it. The mountain had kept his promise. It remembered him not in stone or ice, but in balance and calm, in the patience that lingered long after storms had passed. And in that remembrance there was no sadness, only continuity, because nothing truly disappears in a place. Listen, the snow falls, the ice melts, the water runs, the mountain breathes again. Somewhere within that he remained, not as a memory, silent he loved. And if you ever find yourself standing alone listen to the wind, you might sense a quiet presence, watching without judgment, waiting for you to understand what he once did, that peace is not found in escape, but in surrender. The mountain will still be there, breathing slowly, patient as always. Its silence will stretch around you, vast and forgiving, and you will realize that what the world calls isolation is, in truth, communion. And perhaps, in that moment, you will hear him, not in words, but in the rhythm of the snow, the crack of ice, the sigh of wind, reminding you gently that there is wisdom in stillness, strength in simplicity, and beauty in every kind of ending. So when the story closes, the mountain returns to quiet. Remember, silence it holds is not empty. It is full of life, of memory, of the man who listened so long that he became part of it. And as you breathe in that silence, if you feel even a flicker of calm, let it stay with you. Let it remind you stillness still exists, that patience still has meaning, and that somewhere, high in the cold and endless north, the mountain still whispers his name, not aloud, but in the way light bends through ice and wind moves through stone. If you've stayed until now, walking with him through snow and silence, let the story stay with you. Leave a trace in return, a thought, a feeling, a word, and share it with someone who might need to remember what stillness sounds like. And if you wish to come back to hear more of the mountain's voice and the lessons it keeps, you can. Comment, share, and keep listening. The mountain's silence is always waiting.